Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to take a look at Live Alive for the Nintendo Switch. If you didn't know already, this game was originally released for the Super Famicom in 1994. So this is actually the first time we get to play the game in North America. I have mixed thoughts about the game. It does a lot of good, original, ahead of its time things which actually blew me away. But it also suffers a bit for a game that was made in 1994. Let's get into it. Think of Live Alive as a JRPG compiled of short stories. You fire up the game and you choose from any of the 7 chapters in any order you wish. Each chapter showcasing a different hero. Each chapter only takes about 2 to 3 hours to complete, which suits the portable nature of the Switch perfectly. Have a few hours to spare after a long day? Why not play as Shifu, an aging martial artist who's seeking out a successor to his teachings before he dies? You're going to immediately see a similarity between Live Alive and a lot of the big-time 16-bit JRPGs that released on the Super Nintendo. Especially Chrono Trigger, which is my favorite JRPG of all time. Which makes sense because the people that worked on Live Alive went on to work on Chrono Trigger and other 16-bit JRPG staples. They used Live Alive as a testing ground for their ideas, if you will. Live Alive has you play out different scenarios which take place in one area or setting. You won't be venturing off into big overworlds, but instead the area you explore is only a few screens big, but jammed packed with NPCs and items to find. Each scenario introduces you to the character and setting with some of the most clever and efficient writing you'll find in a video game. Being able to summarize what's happening not just by spewing exposition, but by characters speaking with each other in a very natural way. Once you're introduced and tucked in nicely into the setting, the game hits you with whatever conflict is happening. It can be having to save a town from an incoming group of outlaws in the Wild West chapter, or infiltrating a castle in feudal Japan to rescue an important political person. The scenarios are not grand in scope like most 60-hour JRPGs of the time. Instead, they're bite-sized and full of charm. I was amazed that game developers were trying things so out of the box like multiple chapters in 1994. And that's only the beginning. Combat is handled on a grid, where turn-based battles take place. Certain AoE attacks can affect tiles on the grid, which result in damage to whoever's standing on said tiles. Rather than having a standard MP or magic meter that runs down after using skills or spells, the game opts for a charge-based system which has the player wait for their turn to fight once the meter fills. The player can then use any attack available to them as long as the enemy lines up without fear of using up their attacks. Health is also restored fully after every battle. If a player in your party is downed, he can be revived simply by healing him with a spell or item. If said downed player is attacked before you get to heal them, they are removed from battle. The combat isn't that complex, so you should give this a try even if grid-based combat isn't your thing. It honestly feels like traditional turn-based combat after a while. You might be asking yourself, how in-depth can the leveling system possibly be if scenarios only take a few hours to complete? And I felt the same way until I saw that the game was so well designed around the short chapters, and the leveling is handled perfectly. The feudal Japan stealth chapter, for instance, is probably the most traditional scenario, which has your character leveling up quickly if you decide to defeat enemies. Or you can use the stealth ability to sneak around the enemies and reach the final boss having done minimal battles. I chose to fight and level up, but I'm pretty sure you could take on the final boss just having taken the stealth route. It's important to note that experience and levels do not carry over from chapter to chapter. You see, the short chapters have you relying on upgrading your equipment more so than leveling up in fights, which you will still have to do, but not as much as you'd think. You won't be setting aside hours of your day grinding levels. The overall feel of the game is pretty brisk. The prehistoric chapter promotes you having to find materials in order to craft items that make you stronger, just like in Chrono Trigger's prehistoric level, where you exchange materials for equipment. Another good example of them implementing their ideas in future games. Each chapter has its own unique flavor. No 2 chapters play the same. The prehistoric chapter doesn't even have any dialogue. The story is told through emojis. Some chapters don't even have combat in them, making them feel more like point-and-click adventure games. You know, like those super popular Telltale games of recent years. Another futuristic move made by the developers here. I think the graphical style in Live Alive is some of the best 2.5D graphics I've ever seen. I still think that Octopath Traveler is the best looking 2.5D game. But for a remake, they added so much little details to the environment. I hope to see more games like this come from big developers in the future. I think there's a lot of potential in the 2.5D genre, especially with these games being fully voiced now. Yeah, I forgot to mention, Live Alive is fully voiced. Some of the voices sound cheesy, but they're still fun to listen to. They did the best with the script they had, I guess. That's actually where I had a few issues, the script. Introductory dialogue aside, some of the later dialogue goes on for unnecessarily long. And it seems like that's something JRPGs are constantly guilty of doing. Dialogue box after dialogue box of characters going on about the same thing but saying it in different ways. Almost as if there's a quota of words that need to be reached through padding out the script. Speaking of padding, some sections are padded out way longer than needed. The spaceship chapter being the most at fault here. I get that they needed us to learn the layout of the ship in order to run around later, but I feel like all I did in this chapter was run to elevators and through hallways chasing the next story point. Very little gameplay at all here. It was my least favorite chapter by far, but the story was pretty good in this chapter, so that saved it. And that's the overall theme here with Live Alive. Each chapter introduces you to a unique way of storytelling that you've never seen before in a 16-bit game. Whether it be a certain ability that your character has, which changes how you interact with people, like the mind reading in the near future chapter, which has Akira reading NPC minds in order to progress. Or a gimmick the chapter is designed around, like the Street Fighter-esque chapter, which has you strategically selecting your next opponent from a versus screen. And that's it, that's the whole chapter. Hands down, this is one of the most original games I've ever played. I haven't even talked about some of the more over-the-top things that the game does. I feel like you should experience those things fresh so that you can feel the same surprise that I felt. Live Alive has you covered if you're a fan of the 16-bit era music, brought into the modern age of course, with only a few tracks that get annoying because they might loop too quickly. Sound effects for things like footsteps on different surfaces, on top of the stellar music and awesome voice acting, really helps propel Live Alive into the modern age. I think Live Alive should be played by everyone who's a fan of 16-bit JRPGs. It's almost like a trip into the minds of JRPG developers from back in the day. A demo disc of innovative ideas, some of which came into fruition in later games. I hope you enjoyed the look at Live Alive. Make sure to subscribe to stay tuned for any future videos. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.